Hello everybody. Welcome wherever you are in the world, whether it's your morning, your afternoon, late afternoon here, 5 o'clock UK time, or indeed whether it's your evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I see we definitely already have a few people in the room. I'm hoping that you are lovers of Mary, Queen of Scots. And we haven't spoken about Mary, actually, on a Tudor Talk for quite some time. So I'm really excited that we can bring her back in the spotlight today. And our guest speaker is a perfect expert to talk to us about Mary. Not only does she love Mary, she is a Scot. And so she's going to be the perfect guide for us today. So do say hello. I know there's a few people here. Do say hello. Do introduce yourself. Let me know who's in the room tonight. And of course, as ever for these Tudor Talks, we'll be talking for up to an hour. We'll chat for as long as we need to, but we will be finishing within the hour. You know, if you've joined me before, I'm pretty good at keeping to time. And of course, I have some questions for our guest speaker this evening. But as we go along, if you have any questions for Jade about Mary and about Mary's letters, of course, type them in the comments. I'll keep an eye on the chat and I'll make sure that we get through as many of those as possible. All right, well, I don't think there's any other housework. As I say, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat as we go. I haven't got anything coming through yet, so I do hope it always makes me slightly suspicious that something's not working. So it would be really great, actually, if somebody could type something in just so that I know. Anna, thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. You obviously read my mind because I know there's a bit of a lag on these. So thank you so much. It's obviously working. Thanks so much for joining us today. Okay, let us press on. So just a very quick introduction to our guest today. We have Dr. Jade Scott with us, who is an affiliate in history for the University of Glasgow. And the reason that we are talking is Jade has just, or is about to release, she'll tell us in a moment whether it's out. This is a preview copy that I was lucky enough to get hold of. And Captive Queen, the Decrypted History of Mary, Queen of Scots. And I have to say, I love Jade's writing because she mixes in a little tiny bit of fiction writing that really draws you in before turning over and getting into the non-fiction stuff. So without further ado, I would like to bring Jade up onto the screen. Hello, Jade. Welcome.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thank you for having me, Sarah.
It's a great pleasure. We've certainly got some people in the house today, so I'm looking forward to hearing all your questions. We've got Michelle, we've got Susan, we've got Anna, and I think it's Mary, isn't it? I think people have their little handles, and I try to remember. Anyway, great to have you here. Lovely. Right, now, Jade, first of all, tell us, affiliate in history, what's that? What's your involvement with the University of Glasgow?
So I, as an affiliate in history, folks, I am based at the University of Glasgow. I'm working on developing a new research project, which kind of goes a little bit beyond Mary, Queen of Scots and looks at other Scottish women letter writers. And that's my kind of current research project. And so that's why I'm affiliated with Scottish history at Glasgow. Prior to writing this book that we're going to talk about tonight, I was a lecturer in historical linguistics. So still in the past, but more kind of looking at language in the past. So in particular, I have lectured on Older Scots and early modern English and Middle English, so back to kind of Chaucer's period of English. That's my kind of original background, I suppose. So history, but very much with a language angle there.
Okay, right, lovely. And as I mentioned, and as everybody can hear, you are from Bonnie, Scotland there. Where do you live in Scotland?
So I am based up in Stirling, so it's nice and central. If it's familiar to some of you, it might be because of the fantastic castle that we have here. So we've got Stirling Castle, which is very much one of the key sites associated with Mary, Queen of Scots. she spent some time here, and we know, of course, that James VI, her son, he stayed there and was brought up there, and was baptised in the Church of the Holy Rood, which is just across the road. So I'm in a nice historic part of Scotland, just in the centre between Glasgow and Edinburgh. So it works out well for me getting to various archives in Edinburgh, but also getting onto campus for work. So it's a nice spot.
Yeah, and I went to Stirling Castle 3 years ago. Actually, I think it was just when we were first let out after the pandemic. And I remember are the views. It's stunning. The countryside is absolutely gorgeous there, isn't it?
It is. It's beautiful. And I always say to people, I know I'm biased, but I always say to people, Stirling has a better castle than Edinburgh. We have
I think
a
you're
better
right.
castle.
I agree. I do agree wholeheartedly. And in fact, I don't have it on my list of questions, but actually maybe at the end, if we remember, you could share some of the best places to visit and things to look out for. Maybe some unusual things as well. Maybe that people wouldn't always think to go and see. That would be quite cool.
That'd be fab. Yeah.
Cool. Right. Okay. Right. Let's get into talking about Mary. It's all about Mary. So yeah, tell us a bit more about. Oh, Jade. Oh, don't say we've lost Jade.
Oh, I'm back. Are we back? I thought we had like a little pause where I don't know if I froze or you froze, but we froze. And I thought just wait it out and give the Wi-Fi just a minute to reset itself and we're back. Sorry, Sarah.
It's always one of those moments where I think, oh no, here we go. Anyway, the Wi-Fi came through. Excellent.
Yeah.
No, I was just asking you, it feels when I read this that you really have a love for Mary and a deep respect for her. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think, so for me, kind of being immersed in the early modern period, and in particular in kind of 16th century Scotland and 16th century England, it would be hard for me to not have some connection and interest and awareness of Mary in the period. But for me, what really kind of made me so committed to her, I suppose, is when I was doing my PhD. I actually did my PhD on another fantastic early modern woman, Lady Anne Percy, the Countess of Northumberland. And when I was doing my research for that, one of the things that I came across was just how important Lady Anne Percy was as part of this kind of transcontinental network of support for Mary. And Lady Anne Percy spends a lot of time in Scotland, and then she goes to the continent. And although I was obviously looking at Lady Anne, and I still absolutely love Lady Anne Percy, what really kind of came through for me when I was doing that research was just how extraordinary Mary Queen of Scots actually was, and not just as this kind of iconic historical figure, which of course she is, and we'll talk about that and her reputation and how we can memorialise her, but just how absolutely an incredibly skilled and canny and a real political operator. And I think that's something that's often kind of overlooked about Mary. And so, yeah, that's how I got kind of drawn into her, more than just the kind of general kind of passing interest of being a Scottish historian, being interested in Mary. What really drew me in was these other women, and then kind of looking at how Mary supports other women and how Mary uses her letters to support other women and how women write to Mary and all of these different aspects of Mary's life. It was during my PhD that it all kind of came together with me. And do you know what? It's not that she's kind of had a bit of a bad rep or anything like that. There's been some absolutely phenomenal biographies of Mary over the years. But I do think there's this kind of tradition where we paint her as in very broad strokes, and she's either this kind of romanticised, idealised woman who's never given space to do anything bad, or she's the opposite, and she's this woman who's just purely bad and is totally demonised. And so, yeah, it was really important to me when we talk about Mary and with the book and with my own research. What's really important to me is to give her the space to kind of show off the different facets of her character, her skills, her expertise. And yeah, that's why I kind of love her, and I'm glad that comes across.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I've got lots of questions, but two things. I'd love you to come back and talk about Lady Anne Percy at some point, because I'd know nothing really about her. So that's a new character on the stage, really. I mean, obviously I know the Percy family, but I don't know details about her life. So it'd be great for you to come back and talk to us about that. And secondly, I think, for me, I would agree in terms of how do I see Mary? And if you asked me to describe her, I would never have talked about her political savviness. So I think that is opening a window, perhaps, on a different facet of Mary, and one that I certainly wouldn't sort of have seen so clearly. So I'm looking forward to getting into that. So the aim of this book, if you could summarise what you were to maybe tell us what's in the book and what was your aim in writing it?
Absolutely. So the book focuses folks on the kind of last 20 years of Mary's life. It focuses on this period of, just over 19 years when she is essentially held in various prisons, quite gilded cages at some points, but essentially held as a prisoner, held captive in England. She flees from Scotland in May 1568, and she remains in England right up until her execution in February 1587. And so this book kind of really focuses in on those captive years. That's not to totally dismiss her earlier period of life in France, and also as a reigning Queen of Scotland, and that does come up in the book to kind of give the context of what's happening in her English years. But I really wanted to focus in on her captive years, and the reason for that, for me, and what I've tried to kind of have as the main aim of the book, is to really show off the remarkable resource that we have from Mary's captive years, and that is this huge number of letters that she wrote and that she had written to her. And during her captivity, letters are absolutely crucial to her everyday life and also to these political schemes that she's involved with or implicated in at various points. So my aim with the book was to tell what I suppose is quite a familiar story to a lot of us. We probably all have some degree of awareness of, Mary spending this time in England and Mary being, involved in all these devious schemes, that are ultimately in the end trying to get rid of Queen Elizabeth I, although Mary would disagree that that's what she was ever doing. And I wanted to retell that familiar story, I think, and use her letters as a kind of new way in to those years of her life. And it kind of goes back to my previous point as well, and this idea of her being really politically savvy and actually quite a strategist, because I think in her captive years, again, we've kind of been almost conditioned, I think, to think of her as being like, a victim of these terrible circumstances. And in many ways she is a victim. I'm not downplaying the horrible experiences that she has. But I think we've kind of somehow skimmed over the fact that she has so much agency, even as a captive, even as a prisoner. And I wanted to use, with this book, I wanted to say, yep, it's a familiar story and we all know the ending. And it's really hard to, to kind of get away from that because, if you ask, well, is she successful? Well, no, she gets her head chopped off in the end, and that, that is just how it goes. But I really wanted to go back to those captive years and really try and tease out the different ways in which she is an agent of her own life. And the best way that I think to do that is through her letters. So I've tried to kind of aim to do that with the book. And it covers this long period, as I say, almost 20 years. And it goes chronologically. So, I kind of start with her coming into England and then the various commissions that are set up. And then it moves on to some of the early plots and early uprisings that are linked to Mary. And I've tried to also tease out these two kind of parallel strands in which Mary is engaged during her captive years. And that is one, the big dramatic plots and schemes that we're all excited to talk about, but also the different marriage negotiations that she involves herself in, as another potential way out of this captivity. So that's the kind of broad scheme of the book and what I've tried to do with it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking, there are some historical characters like Anne Boleyn, for example. Oh, to have as many letters.
Yes.
There are so few letters in her hand. It's so, you get these glimpses of her. But yeah, to have such a treasure trove of Mary's personal thoughts and strategies, as you said, as well. Strategies. I just wanted to mention to folk listening, actually, that your publishers have kindly given us an excerpt from the book, which includes a little bit of your fiction writing as well as a bit of the non-fiction bit. So we will be publishing that, folks, and I'll put a link in this video. I'll have to find out if Gemma's done that this afternoon. I asked her to do that, so I need to check on that. But if the link isn't there straight away, it will certainly be following. And no doubt I'll be emailing out about that as well. So if you want to read a little caption, a little excerpt of the book, just look out for that. So thank you for that overview. Now, there may be some people, I think you're right, a lot of us know the general story of Mary, but maybe there are some people who are clicking on this who really don't know. Maybe could you just give us some about the pertinent points that we just need to bear in mind about those 19 years or so that we truly understand kind of what Mary was going through and why she had to resort to writing these ciphered letters?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's a very tumultuous period, in Mary's personal experience, but also in this kind of, in terms of what's going on in England and also in Scotland and beyond, of course, at this point in time. It's a really busy, dramatic period of British history. And for Mary, the kind of key things to bear in mind, folks, is that when Mary fled Scotland in May 1560, it was not her intention, of course, to spend almost 20 years of her life as a captive. She was aware that things might not be straightforward, but she genuinely thought that there would be some kind of support coming from England, either direct support through finances and maybe soldiers, so that she could go back to Scotland and reclaim her throne there, or alternatively, possibly, after a period of kind of a deep breath, I suppose, she could take a bit of a rest in England and regroup and, then move on to France with, Elizabeth's compliance and say you could go to France. Not necessarily, immediately, but just have a breather in England, regroup, get your strategy, get your ducks in a row, and then go on to France. But she certainly never expected that she would end up spending the rest of her life there. That was just, she just couldn't have conceived that it would have gone that way. So when she's in this kind of captive life for so long, initially there's this sense of, well, no one really knows what's going to happen. No one really knows quite what to do with the problem of Mary, because Elizabeth is advised by people like William Cecil, in particular, that, Mary is this, clear and present danger. She is the greatest threat to Elizabeth's security and the stability of her realm. And the reason for this is that, of course, Elizabeth's own question of legitimacy, being the Queen of England, had been questioned by certain parties, certain factions in England. And Mary had a really legitimate, iron-cast claim to the English throne through her own grandparents. And so Cecil was very much aware that, people who weren't particularly happy with Elizabeth being the Queen of England might coalesce around Mary. So she could be this kind of opposing person. And there's also the question of faith and the fact that Mary is a Catholic. And so there's, the idea that people might flock to her in support of her faith, if not, her as a threat to Elizabeth directly. So in the initial periods, the first few years, there's this sense of, okay, well, what do we do? And Elizabeth's being kind of pulled in different directions over what she should do with Mary. She's got, personal reflections on, supporting, other monarchs and not, supporting rebels against legitimate monarchs, because that looks, risky for herself. But at the same time, she's very much aware, because we would never question Elizabeth as being a naive character. She's very much aware of the fact that it's in her interest to have people ruling in Scotland who need English support, who need English friendship, who are happy to have a kind of diplomatic policy where they're allies. So it's a really tricky situation, and it never quite goes away, and they're never quite able to resolve it. And Mary, of course, spends the entire 20 years almost saying, I'm not a subject of England. This is illegal. I shouldn't be held as a subject. One, because I'm not a subject, I am a queen. And two, because even if I was a subject, I'm not a subject of this country. I am a Scot, not an English person. And she never relinquishes that status in her own kind of experience and mind. And so there's kind of peaks and troughs over 20 years where the kind of English kind of go, well, we can't send her back to Scotland because Scotland will descend into civil war, which it does anyway, but it would be even worse if we sent her back. We can't send her on to France because if we send her on to France, all that she'll do is come back to Scotland with a French army, and we can't have French troops on the English border. That would be disastrous. So what do we do with her? So we just kind of, they keep her in these various gilded cages, and over a period of 20 years, things deteriorate. And the reason they deteriorate is because Mary, at least in her own mind, quite legitimately says, well, if you're not going to help me, I'll seek help from other people. And that might be foreign support from Spain, from France at different points in time. I will, marry someone who has enough influence that they can get me out of here. Or I'll take to supporting plots within England who will, as part of my support, get me out of jail. And so there, it really isn't resolved. And this goes on for 20 years. And then there's periods of quiet and kind of tediousness for Mary, and then a new plot comes along or a new scheme comes along. And this just goes on until, the last kind of 2 years before her death, when there's a final plot. And I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail. But in that last one, she's essentially kind of entrapped by Elizabeth's agents, and it all goes downhill from there.
Yeah, very good. That was a great summary because it's a lot.
It's a lot.
That's a lot of time to summarise. But so the letters of it, actually, how many letters are we talking about that we know exist?
Yeah. For Mary, we are incredibly fortunate, but I always say to people it's both a blessing and a curse, because for Mary, we know that there are thousands of surviving letters.
Wow.
We know that the reason we know that there are so many is because lots of them have ended up in, really big public archives. So there's a huge number of them in places like the National Archives at Kew in London or in the British Library. The reason so many of Mary's letters end up there is especially because during her English captivity, so many of her letters are intercepted, and they either don't make it to who she's trying to get them to, or they're kind of intercepted on the way and copied and then sent on anyway. So we have loads and those types of archives. We're really fortunate to have quite a lot up here in Scotland, in the National Library of Scotland in Edinburgh, for example, where we have certainly what is kind of traditionally accepted to be her last letter. So the letter that she wrote the night before she's executed, we have that up here in Edinburgh. The letters are also very much a global correspondence. So they've ended up in, the United States or Russia, and lots have ended up in archives on the continent. And then the other kind of key thing about this huge corpus is that lots of her letters have ended up in private collections. She is one of these women from history that continues to just absolutely draw people's attention, and collectors of manuscripts. But there are people who collect specifically on Mary, of course, Mary memorabilia, but even people who are just interested in kind of historical documents and manuscripts. Mary's letters continue to draw quite a price, actually, and they have ended up kind of scattered across private collections. So it's a huge corpus, and that's remarkable, in particular for Scotland. So royal letters are ones that tend to be better preserved because of who they are and who they're writing to, or the types of things they're writing to, and so many survive, as I say, because they end up in Cecil's papers, and then those become the state papers, and so they're preserved. But to have thousands of letters attributed to one person in early modern Scotland is incredible. And my wider research just now looks at letter writing in Scotland more broadly, and there's a lot more than we first thought, but certainly no one with that number for that period. So she's a really incredible person to look at when it comes to letters. But I did say it's a blessing and a curse, and it is because with such a huge corpus and one that's spread all over the place, it's incredibly difficult to bring them all together. And in fact, there hasn't been a modern edition of Mary's letters, and the last real kind of gathering and an edition of her letters were from the 1840s,
Wow.
and they haven't been brought up to date since. And part of the reason for that is it's just such a huge task. It would literally be a lifetime project, and trying to get the funds and the team together, because you'd need a really large team with different skills, people based in different places. It would be a lifetime project to bring them all together, and they're in lots of languages as well, folks. So you need people who've got lots of different linguistic skills as well. So yeah, they're fantastic, but also quite intimidating and overwhelming.
That sounds fascinating. You're not tempted by this as a lifetime project?
I mean, people have said to me before about, would you do it? And I can absolutely see the value in it. I think it would be a remarkable thing, and I think there would be a real appetite for it, for
Yeah.
people to have access to them and bring them together as much as we possibly can. And I think they could tell us so much if we could do that. But it is very much a, dedicate your life to Mary type project. And as much as I am committed to her, and as much as she is someone who I continue to find new bits and pieces about, from looking at her letters, I keep coming up with little different things that you go, yeah, you've still got the power to enthrall me here, even as a researcher. And as much as that's true, I have other women in my life that I would also like to have a look at, going forward. Other women, give them a chance to kind of shine as well. So we'll see. We'll see. Maybe at some point.
Well, that does sound like that would be an amazing project. But let's get back to her letters. I mean, how would you categorize them? I presume there are sort of different types of letters. I presume there's some very personal letters that are more friendly, personal, but then you've got the political letters. So, yeah, how do you kind of categorize them? What are the main themes that run through the letters that we know of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really kind of fair way of thinking about them, actually, Sarah, is to think about, ones that are slightly more personal and those that are slightly more explicitly political. The thing with Mary, of course, is that the two often overlap, especially, during her captivity, because her personal experience is a political thing. The people around her are using her for their own purposes politically, and she herself is engaging with different aspects of, political culture and diplomacy. But there are letters and there are kind of themes that you can tease out across. Some of the most personal letters are actually letters. There's a fantastic group of letters from when she's in France as a child, actually. So I kind of touch upon them, just very briefly mention them in the book, but they're amazing letters that she writes from France when she's about 8. She's between 8 and 10 years old over this period. And she writes to her mother, Mary de Guise, who's back in Scotland. And these absolutely fantastic letters that she writes that are, visually stunning. She's already got the, iconic signature that we recognise as an adult that she uses throughout her life. She's got this beautiful italic script that she writes in. They're all very neat and polished, even as a child, and they're beautiful. And they're also really kind of quite moving because she kind of updates her mum on what's been going on in France and, kind of shares court gossip with her mother about, so-and-so might be having an affair. And of course, her first governess in France, does have an affair with the French king and ends up having his child. And so Mary writes gossip back about this, but, very much defending Lady Fleming to say, no, it's not as bad as it sounds, Mum. So there are some really nice kind of letters there. And she still writes personal letters kind of throughout her captivity as well. And some of the most amazing kind of personal ones, certainly from kind of that I think are, really fantastic ones, are the ones that she writes to other women. So there's letters, for example, there's letters to Annis Keith, who is the wife of James Stuart, Earl of Murray. That is Mary's half-brother. And when Mary is forced to abdicate in 1567, it's James Stuart, Earl of Murray, who becomes the first regent of Scotland on behalf of her son. So they have a bit of a stormy relationship, as you can imagine. But prior to that, Mary had been really close to his wife, Annis Keith. But Annis ends up kind of getting hold through her husband of some of Mary's personal jewels. And Mary, of course, wants them back. And she writes and she gets various supporters in Scotland to write to Annis and say, give me these jewels back. And Annis never gives them back to Mary. She does eventually give them up, but not for years, and Mary doesn't get them back. And Mary writes these, like a series of extraordinary letters to Annis that are quite formal, not rude, or they're a bit blunt, a bit, you need to give me these jewels back, but there's nothing, overtly explicitly bad about them. They're very formal, and she engages in all the right things that you're supposed to do. And then at the end, she writes a postscript in her own hand, being really quite vicious, saying, if you do not give me them back, you will suffer my displeasure. And not just you, but she says, you and your bairns will suffer my displeasure. So there's some really fascinating ones like that I think are fantastic.
Yeah, I guess that shows us another side of Mary when she's not being quite so polite.
Exactly, yes, absolutely. And I love that because I think, it shows a kind of human side,
Yeah.
we all have moments where you just lose your rag with someone, and and she's going through it, and
Yeah.
she absolutely thinks these are my jewels, you have no right to them, and she just, she kind of loses her temper a little bit, and I think it's nice to show her as being a bit more complex. She's not so much a cardboard cutout,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing with historical figures, isn't it? They so easily get polarized into these paradigms that are so black and white, and it's just rarely the case, isn't it? It's just rarely the case that people are purely saintly or purely evil. There's just a kaleidoscope of colour in there. So a little bit about the etiquette of letter writing in the 16th century. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also moving into this idea of ciphered or secret letters, how did what were the ways of doing that in the 16th century, and what ways did Mary use?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a thing that I always like to talk about, folks. So feel free to jump in, Sarah, if I'm rambling on, because we could spend the rest of the night chatting about this. But I always like to say to people, we're all familiar with a letter at this day and age. We might not, most of us maybe don't sit down and write letters, handwritten letters to our closest friends and family anymore, although, there's a resurgence, I think, for people to bring that back, because I think there's something in that. But we don't tend to do that anymore. But we still have, when we talk about letters, we instinctively know what that is. We're familiar with it. But the difference, I think, one of the key differences is that in Mary's period, letters had kind of slightly different purposes. So they were understood in different ways. And as you say, there's a kind of etiquette behind that. So depending on who you're writing to, there were certain things that you would do that would show that you were being deferential or being really respectful of someone. And things like that is, say someone like me, your average Joe writing a letter to a queen, I probably wouldn't write that in my own hand. Even if I could write in my own hand, I would choose to have a secretary write that letter, because that's a mark of respect. And if you wrote in your own hand, you're kind of saying, we're a bit more closer in a relationship. And you could never really do that to a queen, of course. It would be only certain people could write to them, in their own hand. So, a nice example of that is Mary, when she writes to Elizabeth, she tends to write in her own hand, especially during the captive years. She writes in her own hand. And by doing that, she's kind of saying, we're the same, we're of the same status, we're both queens, we're both women in this really kind of masculine, hyper-masculine role, and it's kind of trying to at least present this suggestion of there being a relationship there that might be a bit closer than it is. If she writes to Cecil, though, at the same time, she would, a lot of the time she would have her secretary write to Cecil, and she wouldn't write in her own hand. And it's a kind of marked way of saying, I am above you, even though I am a prisoner, and she knows he's very much directing the continued circumstances of her life. It's a marked thing to say, well, no, you don't deserve for me to write in my own hand, because I'm a queen and you're just a courtier. And so things like that are really interesting. Where you put your signature on the page as well is really shaped by etiquette as well. So if you leave a great big blank space on the page, you're telling people things with that as well. So when Mary writes to Elizabeth, she often writes her signature right up close, like squeezes it in. Sometimes you can't even see it on the page. It's so tiny, squeezed in. And by doing that, she's saying, I don't need to leave blank space because I don't need to be deferential to you because, again, we're the same. We're of the same status. We're both queens. When she does that to Cecil, though, it's slightly different. She writes her signature kind of right under the page. She doesn't leave a lot of blank space. And by doing that, what she's saying is, again, you don't deserve my deference. I don't need to give you blank space, which is understood in that culture as being a kind of mark of respect and things like that. So there's all these little cues that you can miss easily in the letters. And the same goes with kind of enciphered letters, letters that you put in code. And you can use code, of course, for security purposes. So if you're trying to disguise or conceal something that you maybe don't want people to read, you can put it in code. But you can also use code for slightly kind of different functions. So not that Mary necessarily does this, although she kind of does it with the Duke of Norfolk to some extent. But, in this period, people would use letters in code if they were perhaps love letters. It's a kind of mark of for your eyes only, a kind of play on that sense of it's intimate, it's personal, it's just for you. I don't want anyone else to see it. So people use code for that. Other people use code as well because there's a bit of a kind of vogue, I suppose, for cryptography in the 16th century, and lots of books are printed on, what are the best codes to use for certain things. And if you want to show off your learning, you can put, use codes that are from different languages as well and different cultures, and it's all this kind of extra layer of complexity. So, there are different functions depending on what you do with the page. And Mary is an expert in all of this culture. She is absolutely immersed in it from a young age, and she is so skilled at it, and that's something I've really tried to show through the new book.
So that's really fascinating, because I've got several questions. I mean, why would she be immersed in it? Just because it was in vogue, and people learnt it like they learned how to read? I mean, is that what it was like? And then the second question, can I just ask the second question, because it follows on so it's about how the code was set up, because presumably if you're writing a code, you want it to be unique. You don't want to have a book that everybody can pick off the shelf and have a look. So I've always wondered, how was that code set up initially, particularly in Mary's instance? She's a prisoner. How did it happen? And yeah, so let's start there. Those two questions first.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so she does use code for particular purposes, so she will use, and she puts more and more of her letters into full code. And so I should have probably said that as well, sorry folks, but there are different ways you can use code. You can have a text that is entirely written in different symbols, and that means that you look at the page and you can't understand it without some kind of key. And we'll come back to that because it kind of touches on your second question. Yeah. But you can also do codes that are slightly less, explicit. So you can do things like you'll have just normal plain text written as normal, and then every so often you'll maybe drop in a particular symbol, and it's just to hide someone's name, or it's just to hide a place. So you sometimes find that you'll be, writing away quite normally, and then all of a sudden it'll go, for told me such and such. And you think, well, who's for? It's just a kind of way of disguising individuals. But the rest of the letter looks pretty normal. Sometimes as well, there's no code at all, and it's just, they will use little kind of nicknames or bywords for people. So in Lady Anne Percy's letters that kind of go back to Mary Queen of Scots as well, and their communications, they talk about someone known as the Tailor of Newcastle, and we still don't quite know who this person is, but they seem to be a kind of, an agent who in the north of England who's helping get letters to where they're supposed to go. So you can do things like that. So there are different ways of coding things. But if you are wanting to entirely encode the whole thing, as you say, you want to make sure that it's not easy to break. You don't want it to be really obvious that anyone at all who opens it can look at it. And Mary has loads of different ciphers that she uses. And they can be ones that are a tiny, tiny little differences. So you can literally have, so again, say we take the example of the number 4. Say the number 4 represented Queen of England. Okay, so if they use the number 4 as a symbol to represent the phrase Queen of England, then in another cipher, you might have number 4 again, but there'll be maybe just a little kind of circle on the tail of the 4, or a little kind of flick at the top, a little tiny, tiny detail that changes it. And that changes the meaning of it. It's still related to England, but maybe this time with the flick, it means rather than Queen of England, it might just mean Kingdom of England, something like that, or Crown of England. So there are loads and loads of different variations on the cipher that Mary uses. And when her rooms are searched at Chartley, just before she goes to Fotheringay for her final trial, they find something like over 70 different ciphers. So there's so many variations. Part of it is, as you say, you don't want it to be really obvious. And once you've used one for a wee while, the risk then becomes that more people have seen it. And the more people you use it to, the higher the risk of the secret being broken or the code being broken. So they kind of have to keep changing it to keep things fresh and keep things, secure as far as possible. Sometimes it's really explicit that someone's broken a code or that a code has been, kind of intercepted, and there are letters to Mary's lady in waiting and then supporter Agnes Fleming, Lady Livingston. She receives letters saying that a letter bearer has been arrested in England, so they need to stop using the current cipher, and she needs to wait until someone sends her the new one before she can write to Mary again. So there's all these kind of different, it's like an ever-changing beast, it's always having to be adapted, and it's always having to be changed, and sometimes the adaptations are tiny, sometimes they're a bit more kind of explicit. The other problem that she has is that she's using code, of course, to try and disguise the contents of certain letters. And as she goes on through her captivity, and she becomes involved in more and more explicit plots to free her, this is when we see the coded letters ramp right up, as you would expect, because you're trying to kind of keep things under wraps. And she's aware that her letters are being watched and they're being, intercepted and read by English agents, in particular at the behest of Sir Francis Walsingham. And so, she uses code because she's kind of forced to, because she thinks, well, I have to try and keep some of this hidden from unwanted eyes. But the problem with code is, as soon as you put it in a code, it's obvious you're trying to hide something, isn't it? Because, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm trying to hide things. Oh, I know what I'll do. I'll put it in this really, odd-looking text. But then as soon as someone looks at it, they go, well, yes, you're trying to hide something. So now I really want to know what it is. So I'm going to try and figure out what it is. So it's this really kind of back and forth cat and mouse type scenario that she's in.
Yeah. So I was really interesting. So did Mary set the code up then? I mean, she the instigator. If it needed to be changed, she would change it. And then what happened? Did she create copies and send it off to various people? Is that how it worked?
So with Mary, it's difficult as well, because she is so clever in this regard, and she relies on, throughout these 20 years, she relies on what I like to call her plausible deniability. Okay, and what she does is, if she has letters written in code, she won't sign them, because of course you're not going to go to the trouble of writing up this disguised letter and then go, bye Mary, Mary was here. You're not going to do that. You're going to keep them nice and bland, so that there's no suggestion that it's yours. And that's something that she comes back to at various points in time when she's accused of being involved in plots. She goes, well, I never wrote it. I might have written up the original letter and told my secretaries what I wanted them to say, but when they translated it into code, they must have changed things. And she kind of hides behind that plausible deniability. So what was most likely happening, in her rooms as she's doing it, is she would have probably had access to the various ciphers that were being used at that point in time. But she most likely would either have dictated the contents of the letter to one of her secretaries, and she had a French secretary and a Scots secretary with her for most of the English years. And she would, speak to them and say, write this down, and they would take notes, and then they would go away, polish it up into a nice, clean copy. They'd give that back to Mary, and she would look at it and go, yep, happy with that. And in a normal letter, she would sign it. And in a coded letter, she would go, fine, I'm not going to sign it, of course. So there's these layers of collaboration that she relies upon. And that kind of gets her out of jail a lot of time when she gets accused of things, because she is able to say, well, no, I never wrote that. But we definitely know that she is aware of the different codes that are being used, because even in other letters, they're peppered with references to ciphers and alphabets, and even things like write to me using secret ink. She gives instructions on people doing that. She says it's very vulgar, but she says it can be necessary sometimes. So she's very much aware, and she's clearly had an education of letter writing cultures where she would have known about different codes, but she's relying on other people to do the actual physical labour of producing it.
Right.
And then they would have sent keys, as you say, is there like a master copy? Not quite as such, but they would send keys at different points in time. So you would send your key maybe out a few months probably before you actually started using it, so that it would be separate from any text that's encoded. And then you would say, you would somehow get a message through, usually with the bearer, who would pass that on as a spoken message and say, this key is to be used from December onwards, say. And then they would also then be able to pass it on at some point, like Lady Agnes Fleming finds out, is to say, cut it, get rid of it, we need a new one, it's been intercepted, we need to start again. So there'd been lots of keys kind of floating about. And what would happen is usually someone would kind of so if you received a key to a cipher, you wouldn't want to just leave that lying about. So you would probably want to try and memorise that key at that moment in time, so that if the letters come in, you can then just do it by eye. But, of course, that's not always practical, and some people probably would have had keys on them, and this is why things get discovered. So it's a bit tricky.
Yeah, that's so good. And Kim's asked a really good question, which actually ties, Kim, your timing is impeccable. Because I was going to ask about how do we decode them today? I presume we have some of those master sheets, and I think I saw one in your book there. But Kim's asked perhaps a more sophisticated question, so I shall read it out, and then together perhaps you can answer. Kim's asked, were these the cache of Mary's letters recently in the news after being decoded by tech or AI experts? I remember seeing that in the news. So I suppose we're going to talk, these are, I think Kim's talking about the Paris letters, which we are going to just mention briefly. But before we particularly get into those, maybe just like, how have we decoded them recently? Who's done that work?
Yes, so these particular letters that you refer to, Kim, are the ones that were found by a team of scholars, George Lasry, Norbert Bierman, and Satoshi Tomokiyo. They remarkably managed to come across 50 odd letters that are sitting in the Paris Bibliothèque Nationale that had never been attributed to Mary before. They're letters that are entirely in code, and no one had kind of broken that code before. People didn't really know what the contents were. And then this team of scholars managed to develop this kind of program, as you mentioned, Kim, and they used tech to really break down the code. And as they managed to kind of break down certain phrases and certain letters and people and stuff, they started to think, oh, this might be relating to Mary Queen of Scots. And as they built it all up, they were able to say, yes, these are 50 odd letters that have been previously unattributed to Mary, which is just remarkable. I talk about the fact that there are thousands of Mary's letters that we know about, and ones crop up every now and again, but usually it's one or two, and they come up at auction or something. So for the team to find 50 is just incredible. So that is one of the ways that people have obviously started to develop now. Lashley and the team have managed to develop these programs that have huge potential for the future. But traditionally, we've had to do things in a bit more kind of manually intensive way of decoding. So one of the ways that we can do it is you can, if you are so inclined and so skilled and patient, you can try and break the codes yourself. Now, this is not an easy job at all, as you can imagine. And because Mary has so many different ciphers, it's like trying to do a Rubik's Cube. You get one end and then the other goes. So it's really, really difficult. But people have done similar work for other women and people in the past. So Nadine Ackerman, for example, did incredible work to decode the letters of Mary's granddaughter, Elizabeth Stuart, the Queen of Bohemia, and she has hundreds, if not thousands, of letters that survive as well, and loads of hers are in code. And Nadine spent years going through all the keys and breaking the codes and just doing this incredible work manually. I don't know how she did it. I do not have the patience for it myself. She's just incredible. So you can do it like that, but and this is some people say, well, this is a kind of cheats way, but it's the most time efficient way, folks, of decoding Mary's letters, and that is we have to rely on the expertise of contemporary cryptographers. So what I mean by that is when Mary's letters were intercepted, they made their way to people in the employ of Sir Francis Walsingham, who were absolute linguistic geniuses. So people like Thomas Phillips, who was his lead cryptographer, and he could sit and break codes like no one else. It's just incredible the number of letters that he decoded at the time. And we are incredibly fortunate that his decoded copies of Mary's letters survive. So not all of them, there are still some that haven't been decoded and may now be in the future. We don't know. But we rely on his decoded copies, and they are incredible documents in their own right. And there's one that I've put an image of in the book, so if you get a chance to see it, it's so fascinating. There's a letter, and what happens is that he would get the letter in, it would be intercepted, the message bearer would pretend that he was taking it to who he was supposed to take it to, but it would secretly go to Walsingham and his agents first. They would open the letter, and they would copy down the code very carefully, write it all out on a copied sheet of paper. They would then fold Mary's letter back up and forge her seal so that it looked like nothing had been tampered with, and then it would get sent on, and hopefully the person who received it would never suspect that anything had happened in the middle. And then from their copy, people like Thomas Phillips would try and break it down, and you can see on some of the examples where he's writing in this little tiny handwriting above the line of the code, trying to break individual letters, trying to break words and phrases, and then you can see his working, like his actual working out as he's doing it. And he maybe had a key with him, or he's probably more likely doing it from memory because he has these skills. And then he would then draw up a kind of fair copy of, this is what I think it says. And so we're really fortunate that so many of those survive. And that is actually our kind of prime way into Mary's decoded letters. Right. It's through the people at the time who did a fantastic job.
That's awesome. That's just,
I know, we're so grateful.
Mind-blowing, but awesome. I love that. Can you believe we've got just 8 minutes maximum left here. So I'm going to ask one kind of roundup question, I think, before we start to really bring that together. And so I think it's, what do you think is the single most important discovery that we've made about Mary, her character, or her time in captivity that comes through in those ciphered letters?
Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and one that, if I really had to think about it, I think for me, the most fascinating thing that comes through from Mary's ciphered letters, and really from her letters just as a whole, is her ability to adapt to the person that she's writing to. So she so acutely skilled at all these different levels of complexity with letter writing, whether it's the language, whether it's the way you fold the letter, whether it's where you put the signature and how much blank space you use, what types of chord you're using. She's so skilled at all of it that when you look at her letters, you really do start to gather this huge body of evidence for her being this incredibly skilled person, and this woman who is aware of, I'm a prisoner, my circumstances are deteriorating, and I need to get things from people, you know, whether it's just, you know, can I go to the spa at Buxton for a few days because I'm below the, you know, I'm feeling a bit rubbish again, or whether it's, yes, please send 16 horses to rescue me, Anthony Babington, when you decide to, you know, execute your plot. Regardless of what it is, she is so skilled at just setting everything up for that person that she's speaking to, you know, that she's addressing, and trying to really bolster her request. And I find that incredible because, as I say, and I mentioned at the start, you know, it's really easy to just dismiss Mary as being, you know, having no agency. She's a captive. There's nothing she can do, and that's why she becomes so desperate and involves herself in these plots and ends up with her own death and things like that. And I think that is just, it's just a bit too, it's too blasé, I think, for me. And I think when you look at her letters, you can really see and sense her skill. And we have to always bear in mind that, you know, the letters were the last thing she had in her repertoire. You know, as the 20 years progresses, she loses so many of her household servants and her diplomats. Her visitors are restricted. She loses a lot of her women, who are absolutely central to getting messages out to her supporters. Her health deteriorates. Everything is just, you know, restricted and restricted and restricted, and all she has left to her is her letters. And she just uses them to such incredible effect. And a lot of it is really small things that are really easy to miss, you know. And you know, you really have to kind of immerse yourself in the culture of letter writing in the period to kind of get that. But I do think it's worth the effort. I think she deserves that bit of effort.
Well, thank you for doing that on our behalf, and having the ability to do that. Yeah, and also, you know, just as you were talking, I'm thinking she never gave in, did she? She just kept going. I mean, that's quite phenomenal over 20 years or so. She never stopped fighting. So that's a real tenacity, of
100%.
character in there. So
Yeah, she's
go on.
resilient. Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
resilient.
incredibly resilient. Yeah, all the way through. Yeah.
I'm not sure I would be after 20 years.
No, me neither. Me neither.
So yes, we are coming to the end of this. A couple of things I wonder: can people? Obviously, we have your book.
Yeah,
It's a lovely read. So I encourage you all to pick that up, and I guess it's the usual, all good booksellers. Is it out now?
Yep.
I can't remember. Is it already out?
Yes, it came out officially on Thursday last week, folks. So she is out in the wild.
So only a week old. So yes, give that book some love. So obviously you've got some illustrations in there, and people can see some of the letters, etc. Is there any way you can go online and see some of Mary's letters? Where would you suggest?
There are some you can see that are digitised, and a lot of them have been digitised for the huge big kind of project, the State Papers Online project, but that's not ideal, folks, because it's behind a paywall, so it can be quite difficult for people to access. But there are ones that you can have a look at, and the one I always kind of suggest first is, if you look up the last letter of Mary Queen of Scots, you can just Google it. If you look up the last letter of Mary Queen of Scots, it'll take you to a website which is run by the National Library of Scotland, and they've digitised that letter, and they have, you know, a transcription of the original French, and they've modernised it, and they tell you all about the context of it. So it's a really great resource, a really nice letter to see. So you can see that one there. These aren't, you know, necessarily as much of being able to look at them as such, but you can certainly kind of read some of them in some of those old 1840s editions, which might sound off-putting, but they are out there. They're freely available online, folks, you know, so, you know, you can get into some of them. That is another way in. But there are some other edges as well. We're quite fortunate, actually, folks, that quite recently a letter of Mary's came up for auction. I think it was in 2022 now. But loads of photographs were taken of it at the time, because everyone was like, oh, look, this is another letter of Mary's and it's new. So there are some that you can find on general searches or kind of auction sites, which sounds a bit odd, but it's a good way of getting to see them. And then there are also some, if you look up something like the Folger Shakespeare Library in the States, some of their letters are digitised and they're quite free to access. So it takes a bit of digging, but they are out there. Some are out there that you can look at.
One final thing I asked right at the beginning: what's the one place or thing other than the letters that as a native of Scotland, lover of Mary, Queen of Scots, that you would encourage people to go and see that might not be quite on the top of the usual list?
Yes. That is a really great question, and my heart, as I say, wants to say go to Stirling Castle because it's fantastic, but it is a bit obvious. And I would say that one of the most evocative places that you can go to is you can go to the ruins of Dundrennan Abbey, which are on the Dumfriesshire coast. The actual abbey itself, I'm afraid there's not a great deal left to see, but the ruins are there, and it is marked as the place that Mary kind of stepped away from Scotland. So it is quite, it's got a real vibe about it. It has got it's one of those places that you really feel like, oh, you know, what if she'd never come to
What
this
if?
place? Never lived. And then another one, which is when she's, from when she's little, but is a really incredible place, is you can go to Inchmahome Priory, which is on an island not far from Stirling, and they take you out in a little rowboat, so it's really fantastic day out. Don't go on a horrible day because the lake is not pleasant to go over, but it's a really fantastic day out. And Mary was taken there when she was just like 4 or 5 years old during the kind of invasions by the Earl of Sussex into Scotland, and it's reputed to be haunted by a young girl. And people have said, oh, is it Mary? Is it not? But it's a very evocative place as well. So there's a few places that you could go.
That's fun. I remember writing about Inchmahome Priory and thinking, well, I'd like to go there. So yes, I have to go to. Is it Dundrennan Abbey? I've yet to go.
Yes.
Yet to go there.
Yes.
So anyway, guys, you got a couple of hot recommendations there. Where can people find you, Jade, before we say goodbye today?
So you can find me on all the kind of usual social media devices, folks. So I'm on what used to be Twitter and is now X. I'm also on Blue Sky. If you just search for Dr. Jade Scott, I should come up. And I'm also I'm trying to persevere with the novelty that is Threads. And I'm under Dr. Jade Scott there as well. But my actual tagline is Haberdashery Duck, which is a strange one, I know, but I should come up if you just search for me on Threads. I'm there.
Lovely. Well, we've had some lovely comments, people saying thank you so much, that was great, we'll be buying the book, thank you very much for an interesting discussion. And Mary from St David's, I know Mary. By the way, Mary, if you're still here, I'm busy learning Welsh, so I want to come and talk to you in Welsh at some point. Mary knows I'm trying to relocate to Wales. Anyway, saying it's a great conversation, big thanks to Jade. And of course to Mary. So thank you all, guys out there, for joining us. We'll just say cheerio, Jade. We're going to have you back. We're going to talk about Lady Anne Percy. So with that, I'll say cheerio. And if I can just come back onto here just to finish up by saying, yes, I'm 2 minutes over. Oh, dear me. Anyway, if you don't follow me on Instagram, this is my QR code. You can just point your mobile in that direction and you can follow the Tudor Travel Guide. If you're not yet subscribed to my mailing list, you go to www.thetudortravelguide.com. You'll find out where to subscribe right at the top. Get on my mailing list. You find out about all my latest blogs and podcasts and various events, including tours. And here's a very, very, very hot off the press thing. We are hoping to do something on Mary in Scotland for Simply Tudor Tours in the future. So if you're interested, you'll definitely want to get on that mailing list. Okay, my friends, what a joy to have you here. Of course, we don't do these every month now, but whenever something pops my way, I will be coming back on here to do another Tudor Talk. And if you're on the mailing list, then of course you will find out when that is coming up. So I'm going to wish you a good morning, afternoon, good evening, no matter where you are in the world. And thank you, Mary. Very good. That's very good, isn't it? You said very good. I think I can read that. I think I can translate that. So I'll be seeing you all again soon. Okay, bye for now.